The microphone was still being adjusted when Etta James sang the first note. The engineer stopped turning the dial. He left his hand exactly where it was. He did not move it for the rest of the take. What happened in that studio in Chicago in 1960 is the reason At Last sounds the way it sounds. But the man who heard it first was not a musician. He was 22 years old, and he was supposed to be checking cable levels. Daniel Price had been working at Chess Records on South Michigan Avenue in Chicago for 8 months. He was not there because he had planned it. He had applied for a job at a record store. The record store had been full. Someone had mentioned Chess was looking for someone to help in the studio, and Daniel had gone to the address and said he was willing to learn. They gave him work. He learned. In 8 months, he had moved from carrying equipment to positioning microphones to monitoring cables during sessions, which was not yet the same as being an engineer, but was close enough that he could see what engineering looked like from where he was standing. He wanted to be an engineer. He had not said this out loud to anyone at Chess. He was 22 and had arrived without credentials, and the correct posture for a 22-year-old without credentials in a room full of people who had been doing this for 15 years was to be useful without being noticed until someone asked him to be noticed. He was being useful. He was paying attention. On the morning of the session, a spring day in 1960, the windows in the studio cracked open to let in the first real warmth of the year. He arrived early and spent the first hour running cable checks and positioning microphones according to the diagram the session producer had left on the mixing board the night before. Etta James arrived at 10:30. James Etta Hawkins was born on January 25, 1938, in Los Angeles, the illegitimate daughter of a woman who was 14 years old at the time and who would not be a consistent presence in her life. She was raised largely by a family in the Watts neighborhood who took her in, and she sang in a church choir from the time she was 5 years old, in the way that children who discover early that they have something extraordinary inside them gravitate toward the places where extraordinary things are welcomed. She was a teenager when she recorded The Wallflower, an answer record to Hank Ballard's Work With Me, Annie, and it became a hit. She was 15 years old. She was not, in the music industry of 1954, a person with much leverage. She signed contracts she did not fully understand with people who did not always act in her interests. She spent years in the middle distance of the music industry, recording, performing, struggling with the personal difficulties that would follow her for decades, always a voice that people who heard her recognized as something exceptional, and always, somehow, not quite arriving at the scale her voice deserved. She signed with Chess Records in 1960. Leonard Chess assigned her to a producer named Ralph Bass, who had been working in rhythm and blues for years and understood what he was listening to when he heard it. He understood what he had. The song they chose for her first Chess session was At Last, a ballad that had been recorded by Glenn Miller's orchestra in 1941 as a big band number, lush and expansive and structured around the logic of the swing era. It was a beautiful song. It had been a hit. It was also in its original form, not the thing Etta James was about to do with it. What she did with it required a decision, made before anyone in the room had fully articulated it, to strip away everything the original arrangement relied on and find what was underneath. The tempo slowed. The orchestration thinned. The song became something that had to be held by the voice alone, with nowhere to hide, no big band velocity to carry it, nothing between the singer and the listener except the air. Daniel was positioning the last of the microphones when the musicians began their warm-up. He was on his knees checking a cable connection near the piano when Etta James stood at the main microphone and the room settled. He stood up. He had a clipboard.
He was supposed to write down the cable numbers he had just checked. She sang the first note. He did not write down the cable numbers. He stood with the clipboard at his side and listened. He was not supposed to be standing still.
He was supposed to be moving to the next check, being useful in the specific, invisible way he had spent 8 months learning to be useful. He stood still. He forgot the clipboard. He forgot the cable numbers. He stood in the corner of the studio near the piano and watched Etta James sing At Last from beginning to end. And then the engineer called for another take, and she sang it again. And Daniel stood in the same corner and listened to that too. He was not supposed to be standing there. Nobody told him to leave. The engineer, a man named Malcolm who had worked at chess for 6 years and had heard things in that building that most people never heard, noticed Daniel standing in the corner during the second take. He said nothing at the time. Afterward, when the session broke for lunch and Etta James had stepped out and the room was quiet, Malcolm walked over to where Daniel was still standing. He said, "You're supposed to be checking cables." Daniel said, "Yes, sir." Malcolm looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I know. I would have done the same thing. Go get your lunch." Daniel went and got his lunch. He came back and finished his cable checks before the afternoon session began. He was precise and he was fast because he was thinking about something else, trying to locate, somewhere in the part of his mind that was not occupied with cable numbers, what had happened to him in that room. He was not a lyrical person by nature. He was not someone who described his inner states with any particular fluency. But he had felt something during those 2 takes that he had not felt before, and he spent the rest of that day and several days after it trying to find language for what it was. The best he ever managed in the years that followed was this. It sounded like every love song that had ever been written was pointing toward that one, and she was standing at the place they had all been pointing to and singing it from there. At Last was released in November of 1960. It reached number 2 on the R&B chart. It did not immediately become what it eventually became. The process by which certain songs earn their place in the permanent catalog of things that will not go away takes time, and At Last took some. But it did not go away. It became the song Etta James was known by, the song people asked for, the song that played at weddings and funerals and anniversaries and the specific private moments when people needed a voice that already knew everything about what they were feeling. It has been used in over 200 films and television productions. It has been covered by hundreds of artists. Beyoncé performed it at Barack Obama's first inaugural ball in January of 2009. A moment that was watched by tens of millions of people. Etta James was still alive then. She watched. She had complicated feelings about the cover, which she expressed publicly in her characteristic way, directly and without much concern for diplomatic softening. She was not a woman who softened things. Her voice had always been the most honest thing about her. She died on January 20th, 2012, at the age of 73, from complications of leukemia. She was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1993. She received a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 2003. Rolling Stone ranked her among the greatest singers in the history of American music. Daniel Price worked at Chess Records until the label's operations contracted in the early 1970s. He went on to work as a recording engineer at other studios in Chicago for the next 20 years. A long, quiet career spent in service of other people's music, which is what the best engineers do. He was good at it. He was known for being quiet and precise and for hearing things other people did not notice until he pointed them out. He retired in 1992. He told the story sometimes, to his son, who became a musician, to younger engineers who asked him what the best thing he had ever heard in a studio was. He always described it the same way. He said a woman stood at a microphone in a room on South Michigan Avenue and sang 2 takes of a song, and he forgot what he was supposed to be doing. And a man named Malcolm saw him standing there and said he would have done the same thing. He said, "I checked cables for 30 years after that. I never heard anything like it again." Subscribe to Untold Soul Legends. Every week we find the moments behind the music that changed everything. The comment section is open. Tell us which Soul Legend story you want to hear next. If this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needed to hear it today.